So last week we introduced and kicked off a new study, which is the God I Don't Understand. We're tackling the problem of theodicy. It's a problem of suffering. It's a problem that all of us, at some point in our lives, and some of us more than others, end up having to deal with. And so that's what we're studying. And there's, just briefly, for anybody that wasn't here, just by way of review, there's a difference in saying that we know God and we know His characteristics and we know what the biblical data is about God in His person, and in saying that we understand Him. And that's true of most relationships. I have 3 daughters. I feel pretty confident I know them pretty well. But in terms of understanding why my 3 daughters do all the things that they do, I don't think I could accurately say that I have a handle on all of that. That's true of marriages. That's true of friendships. We know people and their characteristics up to a point, but it's also true that there are often moments where that intersection of knowledge and understanding motives and understanding a person's actions don't always make sense. And so one of the things we kind of outlined at the very beginning is when it comes to God, we need a bit of a balance. We need a healthy balance. Because on the one hand, when it comes to what the Bible has to say about God, we absolutely need clarity, and we need to highlight those particular aspects and attributes of the character of God, that He is loving, that He's trustworthy, that He is faithful. And we see that demonstrated all throughout Scripture. On the other hand, who among us could say that we absolutely understand why God does everything that He does? None of us could say that. And so, in fact, we highlighted the verse Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So that's a bit of the problem that we face when we tackle a problem like suffering. Because there are a lot of people that would say about the things that happen in the world, it's not fair. A lot of us probably have said, that doesn't seem fair. And we can look around us. We can look at our own lives. We can look at the lives of our friends, our family members, and we can say, why is it that this person over here struggles so much, while this person over here, seemingly, their lives are untouched by lots of tragedy or difficulty? And to that, we really have to confess we don't understand it. There are things in Scripture that anger us, just from the standpoint that we look at them and they bother us to our core. There are things we could say that are morally disturbing, things like acts of genocide and war that we find throughout Scripture. And there are things that we could say are puzzling. I think God Himself probably looks at the way that we have, humans in general, have been terrible interpreters of His Word. And perhaps God Himself is puzzled as to why we have such a hard time reading His Word and interpreting it. Good news about it is that there are some things that we don't know everything about, but they actually flood our hearts with gratitude. So what I mean by that is, we know some basic things about the cross that infuse our hearts with hope and with thankfulness, and we understand the forgiveness of sins that's attached to that. But all the workings and all the ins and outs of the cross, and how a physical action like the shedding of Jesus' blood can be applied to our lives spiritually. I mean, there's a bit of a tenuous balance that we have there, where we're trying to figure that out and trying to understand all of that. I don't understand all of that, but it does infuse my heart with hope. And the other thing we mentioned is, if we're struggling with the problem of suffering, guess what? We're in great company. Because nearly every great hero in the Bible at some point struggles with why it is that God does the things that He does. And so what we did notice last week was Psalm 73, which is right in there in the tradition of the great lament passages in Scripture, where human beings are not only allowed to vent their lack of understanding to God, but in this case, they are inspired to do so. so that God not only understands that we're going to have trouble with it, but He invites us to express that. So that leads us to our study today, and we're going to try to just in a non-boring fashion, but it's hard not to struggle with some of this. We're going to tackle today the mystery of evil, okay? And who's ready for that, right? The mystery of evil. And what I want to start out with is a very basic question, which I'm going to kind of, just a little softball question to toss out to all of you. Here it is. Where did evil come from?
Oh no, happening.
Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Jealousy.
Okay, we got jealousy. We got a jealous attribute in the heart of some. I don't know. I want to chase that down further than you actually explained it. But I had a hand. Yeah.
The actions of God.
Okay. Wow, that's an interesting. That's a very good and interesting definition. So we could classify evil as an absence of the presence of God. Right? That's an interest. I would really like to chase that down. Very good. Anybody want to follow that gold star comment up? Anybody else have other thoughts about it? Yeah.
I think it also came from free choice on the part of the devil when he fell.
Interesting. Okay, so we have on the plate now free choice on the part of the devil. Steve, is that where your jealousy comment was?
Yeah.
And,
starting with Satan.
yeah, so.
And then influencing others along the way.
Yeah, so at the outset, we're faced with a personality and a presence that's always associated with the origin of evil, and that's the devil. It's our adversary, the Shaitan, Satan, as he's called in Scripture very often. What can we say about that? Where do we first encounter this particular being? Perhaps motivated by jealousy, who seems to show up in the absence of God's presence, so to speak. What can we say about him? Where does he show up? Yeah. Is he called that there? Yeah. So, interestingly enough, in the Garden of Eden, in Genesis 3, we have the appearance of this being. In Hebrew, this being is called Nachash. Nachash is an interesting Hebrew word because it can mean serpent that flashes in its travels, okay? But in its primary meaning, it means the shining one. Now that's kind of interesting, right? So you almost have the idea that you have this, snakes don't talk. We all know snakes don't talk, right? We understand that. So if we take this as a snake, as a serpent, what we're compelled to say then is that there's some kind of force behind that, right? There's some kind of force interacting with this particular creature that's causing it to act abnormally in an intelligent fashion. Can we all be agreed on that? And what happens in the garden? What happens in the garden? Let's trace it out.
He tempts Eve with the fruit.
How does he tempt Eve?
He alters one word God has said.
Alters one word God had said. So what had God said? There was a tree in the garden that was, I like to think of it as a tree of true choice. A tree of true choice, whereby you have the opportunity to accept or reject the Creator. And so what ends up happening is there is a rejection, but it is instigated by the one word, you shall not surely die. Whereas the warning had been, if you do choose to eat of this, you will die. And it is true that there wasn't an immediate death, was there? It did take a process of time, but we also could, isn't there also a sense in which we could say there was a sense in which there was an immediate death? Because there was a spiritual separation that happened in that moment. Spiritual death of a relationship that had been in one status, but then shifts to something else, something far worse. All right, so let's back that up then. So we've got a little bit of what we might classify as an origin of evil in the human realm. But let's keep backtracking. Let's ask the question now. You know, if we're gonna lay a lot of the issue at the feet of this adversary, where did he come from? Anybody want to track that down? Did I interrupt somebody by accident? Sorry. Where did he come from? Anybody? Let's look up a couple of verses and we'll see if they help us. Or if they just muddy the water. Let's look at Jude, verse 6. Jude is a one-chapter book, so it's not a chapter number to give you. So Jude, verse 6. Let's also look at 2 Peter. Chapter 2. And then one more verse, Revelation 12. So if we have some readers for that, we'll play around with that. You know what? Let's see. Hold on. I just want to pause here. Let's circle back around to those verses in a minute. Let's do that. So, let me ask you this: Is there a definitive text we could go to that gives us a fully described origin of evil? Like, is there you know what I mean by that? Like, a fully described origin of the devil, his fall, of human beings, and I don't know that there is. I don't think that there is. In fact, I would argue that this is a question that we're asking with the origin of evil. I would argue that that is something God does not intend to tell us about in its fullness. And we're left a little bit to struggle over the mystery of evil. But I want to think for just a moment. When we talk about evil, normally our discussions do tend to veer into the direction of the supernatural, with the presence of the devil or the adversary. But most evil spoken of in Scripture is a moral evil that the Bible lays at the feet of human beings. Which is another way of saying that most of the evil discussed in the Bible is moral evil that we do, that we are ultimately responsible for. And to be sure, that is linked to spiritual evil, with perhaps sometimes a spiritual motivator behind it. But there's a couple of ways we could classify evil. On the one hand, we could look at the world and we could see what we might classify as natural evils. So we have things like earthquakes and tsunamis and just what we would say are tragic events that happen in a fallen world in the absence of God. There's something fundamental in Genesis 3 which shifts in the makeup and design of the world, so that the world now has thorns, now has violence, now has bloodshed. There's a lot of things that go on, but there's a natural evil, volcanoes, tornadoes, things of that nature. On the other hand, there is moral evil, and we could classify it in two ways: direct and indirect. So if we're talking about direct moral evil, Joey sees this all the time, every day in his job. This is where some human being makes a conscious decision to harm another human being in some way. And so this is to say that we as humans are directly the cause of somebody else's suffering. And this is a type of moral evil that comes from somebody's wrong actions. So let me ask you a question on the back end of direct moral evil. Should people be punished for direct moral evil? Should they be punished? Yeah. Are there some people who say they should not? Sure, there are. But let me ask you, if you were to be a victim of direct moral evil and that evil were to go unpunished, how would you feel about that? What's a word we might throw out about that?
Unfair.
Unfair? What else? What'd you say?
Vengeance.
Vengeance. It causes anger and bitterness. It would cause anger and bitterness to arise in a human being's heart, right? And to lash out in revenge. We would use a word like injustice, would we not? So there's something about the human heart that expects for justice to be served on some level, correct? There's also what we could call indirect moral evil, where our actions and our negligence can lead to the harming of another human being. So something like drunk driving, or driving while texting, or maybe being negligent in safety precautions with some type of machinery, or just think of all the pollution that's gone into the air over the years with big factories and industries that are just polluting the environment left and right. People get poisoned over those things. Those are negligent actions that are indirect, but they have a tremendous effect on somebody's life, right? And we look at those things and we say, well, how can God allow such things? But I think if we were to sit back and just ask, what might God's reply be? If we were to ask, God, why don't you intervene about all of these things? Theoretically, isn't there a scenario where you could imagine God answering back with a list of questions? Have we ever seen in the Bible where God answered in such a way when he was accused of not being fair, where he answered back with a whole bunch of questions to the questioner? Yeah, the book of Job is filled with that. And so what if, for example, he were to say, well, what are you doing about all the people living in poverty? What are you doing about all the people that you live with on planet Earth who are starving each and every day? There's a list of things that we could go down through. And it's interesting to me, there's an interesting realm of kind of avenue of theological study that looks at the temple and tabernacle as symbolic of the original status we had in the garden. So that the internal design of both temple and tabernacle are meant to hearken back to a time when Adam walked with God in the cool of the day in the garden, and is meant in some way to connect us to a time where we had that one-to-one reality with God on a daily basis. But I bring that up because every relationship in the garden was in some way affected or destroyed by the presence and introduction of sin. Relationships between ourselves and God suffered, ourselves and each other suffered, and ourselves and the world in which we live. All of those relationships were harmed in some way. Such that now we have a division between our hearts and the heart of God, a division between our hearts and the hearts of our fellow human beings, and the world itself is giving forth earthquakes and tornadoes and things that we would call tragedies. So Genesis 3 has an escalation of sin from the heart with its desire to the head with its rationalization to the hand with its actions and to relationships themselves. And so the Bible's diagnosis about sin is radical, it is comprehensive, and to summarize, the Bible's thought about sin is that it seeps down into and pervades every aspect of human life. Even down to, may I really hurt our feelings, even sometimes down to the very motives behind why we do good things. Have you ever seen a kid that does something just so they'll get noticed about it? And it's not really, the heart of the thing is not really in the action itself. It's in, the feedback that they're looking to get. Are adults that much different? Okay, so Job 24 is interesting. How does it start out? What's verse 1?
Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know Him look in vain for such days?
So we could start out and say that Job 24 in some ways lands firmly in the tradition of lament. Lament is where there's a cry unto God about why things are the way that they are and why He's not intervening. So after the introductory verse, what do we encounter? Well, sometimes we encounter individuals who steal things. So there's a list of things, verses 2 and 3, and then we get to verse 4. Why are there people who are needy, who are pushed aside, and people who are poor? Things of that. Verse 7, they have nothing, no covering even against the cold. And that goes on, down into verses 9 and 10. Then we get down to verse 13, and there's a lament about people who are incredibly brazen and not even trying to hide the fact that they are behaving in a terrible way. Look at verse 14. Now we progress in verse 14 to what? Anybody there with me? Murder. You know, what happens to the murderer? Well, he gets up, he kills the poor and the needy. And at night he is as a thief. He steals life. What about relationships? What about adultery? Verse 15. The eye of the adulterer. He disguises himself. On down through. And then we get into, the significance of those who are wronged and how the world just looks at them in an insecure way. So the point that I wanted to bring up when it comes to Job 24 is that it sits firmly in that tradition of lament. So even back in the time of Job, Job's looking at his life and he's saying, why are all these terrible things happening in the world? Where's the intervention of God? Well, look at Psalm 130, and let's, I think I have a reader, right? Hopefully one of you has it ready. In preparation for the verse in Psalm 130, we're very quick to ask, why doesn't God intervene? May I ask you a question in response to that? At what stage should God start intervening, or should He not intervene in favor of free will? In favor of the choice to truly love or reject? I'm going to throw that out there. What sins would you classify as an intervention sin? And what sin would you classify as a non-intervention sin? That's another way to put it. So, that's a tricky question to ask and answer, is it not? Because things that we would say are societally, acceptable, we might not say are acceptable to God. Any of you ever watched a movie that had some questionable content in it? I watched them. I wonder what God would say about that. I'm just asking questions. I don't know. I know that's been a hot button issue in a lot of churches for decades. But I mean, what do you think? Should God intervene and say, hey, pause it a minute. You don't need to watch this, or at least you need to skip the next 3 minutes. I mean, should He intervene there? 2 18-year-olds are out on a date. First date. They hold hands. This is unacceptable in ancient Near Eastern culture, the time in which Jesus lived. Should God intervene? What'd you say? Yeah, it depends on if it's my daughter, right? That's a big deal. The point being is, we really would struggle with being able to say where God should and should not intervene, and drawing clear distinctions and lines between those things. So as we think about our own lives and we think about our own culpability before God, what does Psalm 130 and verse 3 say?
If you, O Lord, mark iniquity, O Lord, who can stand?
If God were to sit down and start cataloging sins, how would any of us do? I would suggest to everybody in the room, you guys have sinned this morning and you're not aware of it. I have sinned this morning. And I'm not even aware of that I've done it. I think a lot of times we overlook that simply because we have a low, I hate to use these kinds of terms, okay? There are people who live their everyday life with a low view of sin and a high view of sin. A high view of sin says that there's a recognition that even down into the root of some of our motives of good things we do, sometimes there's hints of selfishness. A low view of sin would say that we have an internally we have a high view of our own moral goodness. And biblically, what are we told? Well, those who are without sin are liars, and the truth is not in them. Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, were you?
I was thinking about things.
Well, please do. Yeah.
Record this.
Well, he can cut it out.
I can turn it off.
He's a good editor.
I was gonna say, we want God to treat us fairly. God's not treating you fairly, but we don't want God to treat us fairly.
No. Yes.
That's God treated us fairly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it would be very good.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think the way that, the way we might think about it is, that is true. A lot of times we do say, and we did bring that up, it doesn't seem fair. But maybe, to Landon's point, maybe one of the worst things you could ever pray for is for God to treat you fairly. Because what if he did start treating us fairly? I would say that would be a disaster for all of us if God were to daily treat us in a fair manner. Does evil have its tentacles down into even the multi-layered facets of our lives? Yes or no? I was thinking about this, and I was reading something, I was thinking, where did my clothes come? I'm wearing pants from Amazon. I'm not wearing, these are not Armani pants, okay? Your preacher doesn't wear things like that. But, I'm wearing pants from Amazon. I don't know how these pants were made. They could have been made in a pretty rough way, right? I mean, am I the only one thinking? I don't normally think about these kinds of, huh?
I said, I'm sure they were.
I'm sure they were, yeah. And but we have to go on with our everyday lives, right? In some way. So, evil has it, I think evil in some way has its tentacles down into the aspects of our lives sometimes we have no clue about. No clue. So let's stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about the bad guy again, right? That makes us feel so much better, I think, sometimes, to not think so much about ourselves and to think about a person that we can sort of blame it on. The old Flip Wilson comment, the devil made me do it. Well, the devil doesn't make anybody do anything. He can influence, he can tempt. But what can we say about this individual called our adversary? It's one thing to lay the blame of my actions squarely where they belong. It's on me. It's on me. But I would be very naive, and you would as well, to dismiss our adversary completely. So, know thy enemy. What do we know about our enemy? What could we say about it? Anybody want to take some stabs in the dark?
He's had a lot more practice than we.
Les Lynn. Gold star comment. Very depressing. Right? So, this is an adversary who's how old? I mean, we don't know. We don't know. Has he had a nearly infinite amount of practice on human beings who've come before us? Do you think there's anything we could do in defense of ourselves that he hasn't seen before or hasn't tried to work around? The more you think down this avenue, the more depressing it gets. One thing I would say, though, in a positive sense, is that the adversary is not God. So what are some positives about that? Sometimes I see in literature there is kind of this dualism that's hinted at or suggested, where you have on the one hand a good power in the form of God, and on the other hand an equal but opposite power, which is the adversary. And I don't want anybody to have that view. Our adversary is not equal in any aspect to God himself. So what does that mean? Is he omniscient? He is not. Is he omnipotent? He is not. Is he omnipresent? He is not. One text that we are familiar with is the one that says he roams about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So he's roaming about, but he's also located. Now, is he alone, though? Is he alone, though? Scripture seems to indicate that there are legions of like-minded beings. Here's another question. Is he an angel? This is the interactive portion again. We're very hesitant. We often think of angels that way, right? We think of them as demons, which we often classify as fallen angels. In Scripture, those are real assumptions on our part, because Scripture never makes that type of data very clear. So you had some verses that were looked at. So what is Jude, hope you still have those open. Jude verse 6, what does it say?
And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their own home, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day.
Okay. So there is apparently a classification or a particular group of angels that did abandon their original home in rebellion against God. We aren't clearly told in that text what that rebellion is. But these particular angels, that does not say all angels, by the way, and that does not say all demons. These particular ones are in chains. We know for a fact that the chief of them all is still roaming about. He's not in this classification. He's not in this group. So how does this text help us? I don't know. I think it brings up more questions than it answers. What about 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4? Maybe somebody has that one. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4.
For if God did not spare the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into the chains of darkness to be kept for judgment.
Same group being discussed. And if we track that parallel over into 1 Peter, there's yet again a group of spirits that are imprisoned that Jesus goes and declares victory to. So that doesn't help us much either. What about Revelation 12? Do we have that text at the ready? Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9.
Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. There was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him.
Okay, so this is a massively interesting text. And here we do have this title, angels, again being used, but also for those who aligned themselves with the devil. But here the devil is called that serpent, the adversary. All of the names are found together in this place right now. So that's helpful from that standpoint. A lot of people look at this text and they'll say, well, when did this occur? And they'll say, well, this happened, this great war that broke out in heaven happened before the world was created, maybe. Y'all ever heard this before? But if you actually read the context of the book of Revelation, this happens right after the Christ child is born into the world. And it's only in that context, when Jesus is actually born into the world and is incarnated, that war breaks out in heaven. Very interesting. That's interesting timing. And so they're no longer able, Joey read the last verse, they're no longer able then to access, after the war, the heavenly realm. Whereas it seems like, for example, the book of Job, the adversary could still enter into the presence of God, and they could have a conversation back and forth about Job's fate. Very interesting text, very interesting timing. So here's my question. How do any of these texts help us, scholars? Any of the texts we just looked at, how do they help us in learning about the origin of our adversary? I don't know. I think they just raise more questions than we can even answer in that regard. And so let me close out by just saying, I think there is a sense in which a lot of times we say something like this. We'll say, evil makes no sense. You ever heard that before? Man, this happened. It just makes no sense. Why would this happen? We say things like that. And I would suggest to you that's the right thing to say. Evil doesn't make sense. God created us as thinking beings, to be rational beings that contemplate the reasons why behind a lot of things. And I would further state that evil is an intruder into God's original good creation. God's original good creation makes all the sense in the world. But the reason we might say something like evil makes no sense is precisely because evil is an intruder into that good environment. And as a result, it has no proper place in creation, and so we do struggle to understand it. And so, just as we said last week, we'll end out the same way. Evil makes no sense. It may be a better question to ask, rather than why, is to say, how long? And to shift our thinking a little bit about some of that. But we'll move forward from here. Thank you for your interaction. It's a little bit of a heavy process, and you were well engaged with some great comments today and help.